The coffee was lukewarm, and the pie was 2 days old, but Marcus Webb ate every bite like it was the finest meal he'd had all year. The restaurant was called Delphine's, a cramped little diner wedged between a laundromat and a barbershop on the east side of Atlanta, the kind of place where the vinyl booths were patched with silver tape and the regulars knew each other's orders by heart. Marcus sat alone in a corner booth, still wearing the flannel shirt that had made his date wrinkle her nose the moment she walked in. Her name was Deja, and she had lasted exactly 11 minutes. "You drove that car here?" she'd asked, glancing out the window at the dented 2008 Honda Civic parked crooked at the curb, one hubcap missing, a spiderweb crack running across the back windshield. "The one with the coat hanger for an antenna?" Marcus had shrugged, folding his hands on the table like a man with nothing to hide and nothing to prove. "Gets me where I need to go." "You said you work in logistics," Deja said, her voice flattening into something colder. "Like a warehouse thing?" "Something like that." She'd looked around the diner then, at the cracked laminate menus and the ceiling fan wobbling on its axis, and something in her face closed like a door. "I thought this was going to be a nicer spot. My cousin said you had money." "Your cousin was wrong." Clearly. Deja stood, smoothing down her dress, not bothering to lower her voice. "I don't have time to waste on broke men playing house. Some of us have standards." She said it loud enough that the two old men at the counter stopped mid-sentence, loud enough that the teenage busboy froze with a stack of plates in his hands. Marcus felt his ears burn, felt 30 years of careful discipline keeping his face still while his chest tightened with something between shame and relief. She turned on her heel and walked out without touching her water glass, the bell over the door jangling behind her like an exclamation point on her disgust. For a long moment, nobody in the diner moved. Then a woman appeared at his table, tall and unhurried, her dark hair pulled back in a low bun with a pencil tucked behind one ear, an apron tied twice around her waist because it was made for someone bigger. She set down a slice of cherry pie without being asked, then a fresh mug of coffee, steam curling up from the black surface. "On the house," she said, and her voice had a low, easy warmth to it, like she'd said the words 100 times to 100 different people and still meant them each time. "Look like you could use something sweet." Marcus looked up at her, startled out of his own humiliation. Her name tag read Simone, slightly crooked, the plastic edge worn smooth from years of handling. Her eyes were dark brown, steady, unbothered by the scene that had just played out 6 feet from where she stood. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't." She glanced toward the door where Deja's silhouette was already shrinking down the sidewalk. "Some people come in here thinking a place tells you everything about a man. It doesn't." She shrugged, the apron strings shifting against her hips. "Eat your pie before it gets cold." "Well, colder." He almost laughed. It surprised him how close the sound came to breaking free after a night like this. "Thank you," he said, and meant it more than she could have known. She gave him a small nod and moved off toward another table, refilling coffee, calling someone baby in the easy way Southern waitresses did, like the word cost nothing and meant everything. Marcus watched her go and felt something shift quietly in his chest, some old, tired part of him that had learned not to trust kindness without calculating the angle behind it. But there was no angle here. She had no idea who he was. That was the whole point of his life these days, the architecture he'd built brick by brick over 4 years. Marcus Webb, 38 years old, sole owner and founder of Webb Freight Solutions, a logistics empire that moved cargo through 6 ports and controlled a fleet of 1,100 trucks across the Southeast. His net worth, according to the last valuation his CFO had run, sat somewhere north of $2.3 billion. He owned a penthouse on the 31st floor of a building downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a wine room he never used. He owned 3 other properties he barely visited. He had a driver on retainer, a driver he almost never called, because Marcus preferred the version of himself that could walk into a diner like this one and disappear into the wallpaper. He had one rule when it came to dating. Only one. But it was ironclad, unbendable, non-negotiable in a way that nothing else in his life was anymore. Never let a woman know he had money. Not on the first date. Not on the 5th. Not until he was certain, bone-deep certain, that she wanted him and not the empire attached to his name. It hadn't always been this way. For years ago, his ex-wife, Renee, had left in the middle of the night while their daughter slept 2 rooms away, left with a note and a lawyer's number and a settlement request that made even Marcus's attorneys raise their eyebrows. She hadn't left because she stopped loving him. She'd left because, as she put it in the one conversation they had after the papers were filed, she'd fallen in love with the money before she fell in love with him. And once the money started feeling normal, he'd stopped feeling like enough. It had gutted him in a way business failures never could. He'd built an empire out of nothing, out of one used truck and a business loan his own mother co-signed with trembling hands. And none of that mattered when the woman who shared his bed for 6 years walked away, without looking back at their daughter's door. After Renee, there had been others. Women who lit up like Christmas trees the moment they learned his last name, who suddenly found his jokes funnier and his receding hairline more distinguished. Women who asked pointed questions about his properties within the first 20 minutes, who angled their phones just right to make sure the right people saw who they were with. He'd tried dating within his own circles at first, executives and socialites, and found the same hunger dressed up in nicer clothes. So he changed the game. He drove the Civic. He wore flannel and work boots that had never touched an actual warehouse floor. He told women he worked in logistics, technically true, technically the understatement of the decade, and let them assume whatever modest life that implied. He watched every single time to see what happened when they believed there was nothing to gain. Most of them, like Deja, revealed themselves within the hour. But it wasn't really about him anymore. Not primarily. It was about Zora. His daughter was 6 years old, sharp as a blade wrapped in ribbons and glitter, with 2 puffy afro-textured ponytails that his housekeeper Miss Odessa styled every morning while Zora narrated elaborate stories about the day ahead. Zora had watched her mother's departure with eyes too old for her face, had asked Marcus once, in the flat, devastating way only children can manage, whether mommy left because Zora wasn't fun enough. It nearly broken apart answering that question. He would not let another woman walk into his daughter's life chasing dollar signs. He would not let Zora learn at 6 years old that love came with a price tag attached, that people could look at your family and see only the numbers behind it. If he had to drive a dented Civic and eat cold diner food to protect her from that lesson, he would do it 1,000 times over. He just hadn't expected the diner to feel like this. Hadn't expected a stranger's small kindness to sit in his chest like a lit match. He finished the pie. It was against all odds delicious, tart cherries and a crust that hadn't come from a freezer bag, made by someone who still believed food should taste like care. When Simone passed by again, he caught her eye and lifted the empty plate slightly, a wordless compliment, and she smiled, quick and real, before moving on to the next table. He left a $100 bill folded under his coffee mug when he finally stood to leave, tucked so it wouldn't catch the eye of anyone but her. It wasn't about the money. It was the only language he had left to say thank you without saying too much. He drove the Civic home that night with the radio off, thinking about brown eyes and cherry pie and the particular grace of a woman who'd looked at a humiliated man and decided, without being asked, that he deserved better than what he'd just received. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself a lot of things that year that turned out not to be true. 2 days later, he was back at Delphine's, and he told himself that meant nothing too. He came alone this time, no blind date trailing behind him with expectations already curdling into disappointment. He slid into the same corner booth out of some instinct he didn't examine too closely, and when Simone appeared at his table with her order pad already in hand, something in her face suggested she'd clocked him the moment he walked through the door. "Back again," she said, not quite a question. "Pie's good," he said. "Figured I'd earn it this time. Pay full price and everything." That got a real laugh out of her, low and surprised, like she hadn't expected him to be funny. Big spender. She scribbled something on her pad. "Coffee, black, and the cherry pie. Am I close? Scary close. I've got a gift." She tucked the pad into her apron pocket. "Rough date the other night?" He winced, and it wasn't entirely performance. "That obvious?" "Baby," the whole restaurant heard it. Her voice softened. No judgment in it, just a kind of weary understanding. "Some folks think a nice car makes a nice man. Backwards way to look at the world, if you ask me. Nobody asked you, he said, teasing, testing the water to see if she'd bristle. She didn't. She grinned instead, hip cocked against the edge of the booth. Nobody ever does, and yet here I am, giving my opinion for free along with the pie. She glanced toward the kitchen where someone was calling an order, then back at him. I'm Simone, by the way, in case the crooked name tag didn't already tell you. Marcus, he said, and it felt strange and good to say his real name to someone who had no idea what it was attached to. Marcus. She said it like she was trying on for size. All right, Marcus. Let me go get your pie before Reggie back there burns the crust again. He watched her walk away and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something loosen in his chest that had been clenched tight since Renee packed her bags. Over the following weeks, he became a regular at Delphine's, sliding into that same corner booth too, sometimes 3 times a week, always around the same hour when the dinner rush thinned out and Simone had time to linger at his table between orders. He learned things about her in fragments, the way you learn a person you're not supposed to be falling for, one careful piece at a time. She'd been at Delphine's a little over a year, she told him one evening, though she was cagey about what she'd done before that, waving the question off with a joke about a boring desk job that didn't suit her. She loved baking, she said, had taught herself from her grandmother's handwritten recipe cards, cherry pie being the one she was proudest of because it had taken her 4 attempts to get the lattice crust right. She had no family in the city, she mentioned once, quickly, like she regretted letting it slip, and then changed the subject before he could ask a follow-up. He noticed the inconsistencies the way a man built to notice inconsistencies for a living would notice them. Her hands, when she wasn't carrying trays, were soft in a way that didn't match years of restaurant work. Her vocabulary shifted sometimes, sliding from easy Southern colloquialisms into something sharper, more clipped, the cadence of someone who'd spent years in rooms where words were weapons. Once, when a customer's car declined and he got belligerent about it, Simone had defused the whole situation with a calm, commanding authority that felt less like customer service and more like someone accustomed to running a room. He filed it all away and said nothing because he understood, better than most, what it meant to build a life that hid the truth of who you were. He brought Zora to the diner for the first time on a rainy Saturday afternoon, 6 weeks into whatever this was becoming, and it was Zora, predictably, who blew the whole thing wide open in under 10 minutes. Daddy says you make the best pie in the whole world, Zora announced the moment Simone approached their booth, swinging her legs against the vinyl seat, 2 ponytail puffs bobbing with emotion. He talks about it at dinner. A lot. Zora, Marcus said, feeling heat crawl up his neck. He does. He said your name in his sleep one time, and I heard him, and I asked Miss Odessa who Simone was, and she said probably nobody, and I said it's definitely somebody, because people don't say nobody's name in their sleep. Okay, Marcus said, laughing despite himself, dragging a hand down his face. Okay, that's enough testimony from the witness stand. Simone was grinning, so wide her whole face had transformed, delighted in a way that made her look years younger. Is that so? She said, crouching down to Zora's eye level with the easy instinct of someone who genuinely liked children rather than merely tolerating them. Well, I appreciate the character reference. What's your name, baby? Zora. Like the writer. My daddy picked it because he says words matter, and I should have a name that means something. That's a beautiful name. Simone glanced up at Marcus, something warm and curious in her expression. He sounds like a thoughtful daddy. He's the best daddy, Zora said matter-of-factly, the way children state facts about weather or gravity. He does my hair on the days Miss Odessa is off, and he doesn't even mess it up too bad anymore. Can I get the pie too? You most certainly can. Simone stood, smoothing her apron. Extra cherries, just for the character witness. From that day forward, Zora became Simone's most reliable ally, conducting what could only be described as an ongoing background investigation disguised as friendly conversation. Do you have a boyfriend? Do you like my daddy? Would you ever want kids because I'm already made and you wouldn't even have to do the hard part? Marcus apologized repeatedly, mortified, and Simone laughed every single time, answering each question with a patience that told him more about her character than 100 adult conversations could have. She's testing me, Simone said one evening, watching Zora color at the counter while Reggie the cook let her help arrange napkins into elaborate structures. Kids do that. They know before we do. Know what? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already understood the answer. Simone looked at him for a long moment, something unguarded flickering across her face before she caught it and folded it back away. Whether someone's worth trusting, she said quietly. Kids don't care about the stuff we care about. Cars, jobs, houses. They care whether you're kind when nobody's making you be. And what's your read? He asked, his voice lower than he intended. Jury's still out, she said, but she was smiling when she said it. And later that night, when he walked her to her car after her shift ended, she let her fingers brush his as they said good night, a small deliberate thing that neither of them acknowledged out loud. Their first real date happened 3 weeks after that, and Marcus spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding where to take her, because every instinct he had toward impressing a woman was an instinct he'd spent 4 years actively suppressing. He settled on a food truck festival in Piedmont Park, string lights strung between oak trees, the smell of fried catfish and jerk chicken thick in the evening air, a place where a man in flannel and work boots didn't look out of place among the crowd. They walked for hours, sampling everything, arguing cheerfully about whose plate had the better find, and somewhere around the third food truck, Simone laughed at something he said so hard she had to grab his arm to steady herself, and neither of them let go once the laughter passed. Tell me something true, she said later, when they'd found a bench beneath a magnolia tree, the noise of the festival softened by distance. Something you don't tell people. He thought about it, thought about all the things he couldn't tell her yet, and reached instead for a smaller truth that still cost him something. I used to think if I worked hard enough, everything else would fall into place. My marriage, my daughter's happiness, all of it. He looked out at the lights. Turns out hard work builds a lot of things. It doesn't build the things that actually matter. Simone was quiet for a moment, watching him with an intensity that made him feel unusually exposed. My turn, she said finally. I used to think if I got powerful enough, nobody could ever make me feel small again. She twisted her hands together in her lap. Turns out power just gives people better reasons to try. Who tried? He asked gently. A lot of people. She shook her head, a small motion, like she was physically shaking off the topic. Someday. Not tonight. He didn't push. He understood the shape of a locked door, having built several of his own. He kissed her for the first time that night, under the magnolia tree, soft and unhurried, her hand curling into the front of his shirt like she was anchoring herself to something solid. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his and laughed quietly, disbelieving. This is a bad idea, she murmured. Probably, he agreed, not letting go of her waist. I don't even know your last name. Webb, he said, and it wasn't a lie, just an incomplete truth, the same incomplete truth he'd been offering for weeks now, and he felt the weight of it settle heavier in his chest than it had before. The guilt started in earnest after that night, a low, persistent hum beneath every good moment they shared. He told himself he'd tell her soon, once he was certain, once the ground felt steady enough to risk it. But every week that passed made the eventual confession harder to imagine, because every week she fell a little further, believed a little more completely in the ordinary logistics worker who split his time between a modest apartment and diner pie, and every week the gap between that man and the truth of Marcus Webb widened into something he wasn't sure he could bridge. Zora, meanwhile, had made her verdict clear. She started asking when Simone was coming to their house, a phrase that made Marcus's chest ache every time she used it, because their house was a penthouse with a doorman and a view that cost more monthly than most people's mortgages, and Simone still believed he shared a 2-bedroom rental with his daughter and a stack of unpaid parking tickets. He brought Zora by the diner one afternoon when Simone was between shifts, and Zora, with the devastating directness only a 6-year-old could manage, asked Simone point-blank whether she'd marry her daddy someday. Zora, Marcus said, mortified for what felt like the 100th time. But Simone didn't laugh this time. She knelt down, taking Zora's small hands in hers, her expression serious in a way that made Marcus's heart stutter. That's a big question, she said gently. Marrying somebody means you trust them with everything, Even the stuff you can't see yet. Do you trust my daddy? Simone glanced up at him, something searching and vulnerable in her eyes. I'm getting there, she said softly. I think he's still got some things to tell me. And I think I've got some things to tell him too. Zora, satisfied with an answer that mostly went over her head, wandered off to help Reggie with the napkins again. And Marcus and Simone stood there in charged silence, both of them aware that something had shifted, that the easy fiction they'd been living inside had a shelf life neither of them could ignore much longer. What did you mean by that? He asked quietly. About having things to tell me? Something flickered across her face, fear maybe, or resolve, hard to tell which. Not today, she said. Soon. I promise you soon. She reached up and touched his jaw, brief and tender. But I need you to know something first. Whatever I tell you, it's not going to be simple. And I need to know you can handle complicated before I hand you mine. I can handle complicated, he said, and thought, with a stab of guilt so sharp it nearly took his breath, that he had absolutely no room to be asking her for honesty when he was hoarding his own. That night, lying awake in his penthouse while Zora slept down the hall, he made himself a promise. He would tell Simone the truth. Not next week, not once he'd built up more courage. The next time he saw her. No more excuses, no more careful omissions dressed up as prudence. He never got the chance to keep that promise on his own terms. The meeting had been on his calendar for 3 weeks, marked in his assistant's calendar under a name he barely registered because his COO handled most acquisition targets before they ever reached his desk. Aurelia Holdings, a diversified investment firm looking to fold a major logistics arm into their portfolio, a deal worth just under $1.4 billion if it closed the way everyone expected it to. Marcus had reviewed the financials on his tablet the night before, distracted, his mind circling back to Simone's face and the promise he intended to keep. He wore a suit that morning for the first time in longer than he could remember, dark charcoal, tailored precisely to his frame, his beard trimmed close by his usual barber, every trace of the flannel-wearing man from Delphine's stripped away and replaced by the version of himself the business world recognized. His driver took him downtown to a glass tower where Aurelia Holdings occupied the top 4 floors, and he rode the elevator up with his general counsel and his CFO flanking him, running through terms he'd already memorized. The boardroom was the kind designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, a table long enough to seat 20, water glasses arranged with surgical precision. Marcus took his seat at the head of his side of the table, his team settling in around him, and waited. The doors opened at exactly 9 o'clock. A procession of Aurelia executives filed in first, sharp suits, tablets, the practiced neutrality of people about to negotiate for very high stakes. And then, at the center of them, walking with an authority that filled the room before she even spoke, was Simone. Except she wasn't wearing an apron. She wasn't wearing a crooked name tag. She wore a deep emerald suit that fit like it had been made for exactly this moment. Her hair, no longer pulled back in a low bun, but styled in soft waves that framed her face, gold hoops catching the light. She carried herself like someone who had never once in her life doubted her right to occupy a room. She stopped walking the moment she saw him. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. The entire boardroom hovering in confused silence around 2 people who had clearly not expected to see each other here. Marcus felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him, felt every carefully constructed piece of his double life crash into every carefully constructed piece of hers. Marcus, she said, and her voice, though steady, carried a tremor underneath that only he would have recognized. Simone, he managed, and beside him his CFO shot him a startled glance, clearly parsing the fact that his boss appeared to be on a first-name basis with the CEO of the company they'd come to negotiate with. Because that was who she was. Simone Bellamy, CEO and majority owner of Aurelia Holdings, a firm she'd built from a single acquisition 8 years ago into a diversified empire worth well over $3 billion. A woman whose face occasionally appeared in business publications he'd apparently never bothered to read closely, because he'd been too busy building his own fortress of secrecy to notice hers. You two know each other? One of the Aurelia executives asked carefully, glancing between them. We've met, Simone said, her voice clipped now, professional, a wall sliding down over whatever had just cracked open in her expression a moment ago. She took her seat at the head of her side of the table, folding her hands in front of her with a composure Marcus recognized as hard-won. "Shall we begin?" The negotiation that followed was, by any professional measure, a disaster. Marcus barely tracked the terms being discussed, his mind looping endlessly through weeks of memories now recontextualized in devastating clarity. The inconsistencies he'd noticed and dismissed. The soft hands. The commanding authority beneath the waitress uniform. She'd known, he realized with mounting horror, or at least suspected, that he wasn't who he claimed to be, the same way he'd suspected about her. They'd been two people in disguise, circling each other, each one certain they were the only liar in the room. Simone, for her part, conducted herself with icy precision, addressing him only as Mr. Webb, refusing to meet his eyes for anything longer than the negotiation required. When the meeting adjourned 2 hours later without resolution, both sides agreeing to reconvene, she was gone from the boardroom before he'd even gathered his materials, disappearing through a side door with her executive team trailing behind her like a wake. He caught up to her in the hallway outside a bank of elevators, his security detail hanging back at a discreet distance when he waved them off. "Simone." She stopped but didn't turn around immediately, her shoulders rigid beneath the emerald fabric of her jacket. When she finally faced him, her eyes were glassy, though her jaw was set with the kind of control that spoke of years spent refusing to let anyone see her cry. "Billionaire," she said, the word coming out flat and disbelieving. "You let my daughter, believe you drove that car because you couldn't afford anything better." "She's not your daughter," he said quietly, immediately regretting the pettiness of it. "You know what I mean?" Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "You let Zora believe things about her own life that weren't true. You let me believe things. Weeks, Marcus. Weeks of pie and food trucks, and you sitting there letting me think I was falling for some ordinary man trying to make it, while the whole time you were worth more than every restaurant on that block combined." "I was going to tell you," he said. "Last night I decided. I was going to tell you the next time I saw you." "How convenient," she said, bitterness lacing every syllable, "that the truth found us both before you got the chance to control how it came out. That's not fair. You weren't exactly walking around with a name tag that said CEO either, Simone." She flinched at that, and for a moment something raw and guilty crossed her face before the wall came back up. "That's different, is it?" "Yes," she snapped, and then, quieter, more honest, "I don't know. Maybe it's not. But at least I never let a 6-year-old build a fantasy around a lie." Her voice wavered. "She asked me if I trusted you. Do you understand what that meant to me? A little girl asking a stranger if she trusted her father. And I said I was getting there. I'm in it, Marcus. I was getting there." "You still can," he said, reaching for her hand, and she let him take it for one brief, aching second before pulling away. "I have a company to run," she said, "and apparently a billion-dollar deal to renegotiate with a man I no longer know how to trust. I need space. I need to think." The elevator arrived, and she stepped inside without looking back, and Marcus stood alone in the hallway of a glass tower, feeling the particular devastation of a man who had built his entire strategy for protecting his heart and somehow still managed to break it, along with someone else's, in the exact way he'd sworn he never would. Word traveled fast in the circles that mattered, and within days the story had leaked, twisted and reshaped by anonymous sources into something far uglier than the truth. A gossip column ran a piece under the headline, "Billionaire Playboy's Diner Deception Threatens Historic Merger," painting Marcus as a predator who'd manipulated a working-class waitress for sport, conveniently omitting that the working-class waitress was herself a billionaire in disguise. Another outlet ran a piece questioning Simone Bellamy's judgment, asking whether a CEO capable of being fooled by her own employee suitor could really be trusted to helm a major acquisition. Marcus suspected, and later confirmed, that the leak had come from Deja, his humiliated blind date, who had apparently recognized Marcus's photo when the Aurelia deal made local business news and decided a little public revenge was worth the price of her own credibility. She gave an interview to a local blog, describing in exaggerated detail how Marcus Webb had tried to pass himself off as a broke logistics worker to test whether she was a gold digger, framing herself as the victim of an elaborate, cruel experiment. The story metastasized from there. Board members at Aurelia Holdings, already uneasy about a merger this large, seized on the scandal as justification to slow the deal, some openly questioning whether Simone's personal entanglement with Marcus Webb compromised her objectivity. A rival investment group, led by a slick, ambitious man named Preston Hale who had been circling the Aurelia deal for months hoping to insert his own firm as a competing suitor, used the scandal as leverage, publicly suggesting in an interview that Simone Bellamy's leadership had grown distracted by personal drama and that Aurelia's shareholders deserved better stewardship. Preston had history with Simone that predated any of this. A failed business partnership years earlier that had ended with him losing significant capital and considerable pride, and he seemed almost gleeful at the opportunity to twist the knife now that circumstance had handed him the blade. He requested an emergency meeting with Aurelia's board, publicly hinting he might mount a hostile bid for portions of her portfolio if her judgment continued to appear compromised. Simone called an emergency session of her own board first, cutting Preston off before he could gain further traction, and it was there, in a room full of skeptical executives and nervous shareholders, that she made a choice that would define everything that came after. She stood at the head of the table, composed despite the storms swirling around her, and addressed the room without notes. "I know what's being said," she began, "that I let personal feelings compromise this negotiation, that I was manipulated, or that I've become a liability. I want to address it directly, because I think you all deserve honesty, even when it costs me." She paused, glancing briefly toward the door as though steadying herself. "Yes, I was involved with Marcus Webb before I knew who he was. Yes, that complicates the optics of this deal. But let me be clear about something else. I spent a year working undercover in that diner, in restaurants across this city, because I wanted to understand the operational realities of the hospitality logistics sector before this firm committed capital to it. Every insight I brought into our due diligence on food service supply chains came directly from that experience. It wasn't distraction. It was preparation." Several board members exchanged glances, clearly unaware of this detail until now. "As for Mr. Webb," she continued, her voice steady despite the personal cost of every word, "his company is the strongest logistics operation in this region. Full stop. That was true before I ever set foot in that diner, and it remains true now. If this board chooses to walk away from this deal because of gossip column speculation about my personal life, we will be making a financially irresponsible decision to protect nothing but our own discomfort." She let that land. "I will not resign over a headline, but I will resign before I let this board sabotage a historically strong deal because a man I have complicated feelings for happens to be the counterparty. Vote however you need to vote. I stand behind the merits of this transaction." It was a costly gamble, staking her leadership on a deal now inextricably tangled with her personal life, giving Preston Hale and every skeptic in the room precisely the ammunition they'd wanted, and yet delivering it with such unflinching command that the room's skepticism visibly softened. The board took the vote to committee for review rather than killing it outright, a smaller victory than she wanted, but not the disaster her enemies had hoped for. News of her stand reached Marcus within the hour, relayed by his CFO, who'd heard it through industry channels, and something in his chest cracked open at the knowledge of what she'd risked. She defended him, defended the deal, defended her own judgment, all while presumably still furious with him, all while her own reputation hung in the balance. He drove to Aurelia's headquarters that evening in the Civic, badge checked past security, who clearly recognized his face from the news cycle now, and found Simone still in her office long after most of the building had emptied out, staring out at the city lights with a glass of untouched water on her desk. "You didn't have to do that," he said from the doorway. She turned, unsurprised to see him, like some part of her had been expecting this. "I didn't do it for you," she said, though there was less bite in it than before. "I did it because it was true. The deal is sound. I'm not going to let Preston Hale or a tabloid blog decide my company's future." Still, he stepped further into the office. "Thank you." She studied him for a long moment, arms crossed, guarded but no longer entirely closed off. "You should sit down," she said finally, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Because I have some things to say, and I need you to actually listen instead of trying to fix it." He sat. "I grew up watching my mother work 3 jobs so I could go to a decent school," Simone said, her voice quieter now, stripped of the boardroom armor. "When I finally built something of my own, I promised myself I'd never let money change how I saw people or how people saw me. So every year I go back into the field. I wait tables. I work retail. I remind myself what it feels like to be looked past. It keeps me honest." She looked down at her hands. "I wasn't lying to you about who I fundamentally am, Marcus. I just wasn't telling you the whole architecture of my life. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel that way to you right now. I understand that better than you might think," he said carefully. "Do you?" Her eyes flashed. "Because from where I'm sitting, you didn't do this once a year to stay grounded. You did it as a permanent strategy. You build an entire false identity to test every woman who came near you, and you let your daughter live inside that test without her consent." The accusation landed hard because it was true, and Marcus didn't try to argue his way around it. "You're right," he said. "I told myself I was protecting Zora, and some of that was real. But somewhere along the way it stopped being protection and started being control. I wasn't testing women to find someone trustworthy. I was hiding so thoroughly that no one could ever get close enough to hurt me again. And I dressed that fear up as fatherly wisdom." He rubbed a hand over his face. "You didn't deserve to fall for a man who wasn't giving you the real him. Not even close to the real him." Simone was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Zora asked me something else before all this happened," she said finally. "She asked if I liked her daddy for real, or if I liked the story about him. I didn't understand the question then. I think I do now." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I liked the man who noticed I was tired at the end of a shift and always left a good tip even before he could afford it. I told her I liked the man who let his daughter interrogate me for weeks without ever once telling her to stop." Simone's voice thickened. "I meant every word of that. I still do. That's the part that makes this so hard, Marcus. The man I fell for wasn't fake. He was just incomplete." "Then let me be complete," he said, leaning forward. "No more strategy. No more hiding. I'll tell you everything, every ugly fear that built this whole disaster, and you can decide from there whether it's something you want to build with. But I'm done making you fall for half a man." She studied him for a long moment, something softening at the edges of her guarded expression. "That's a start," she said. "But I need more than words this time. Words are cheap, Marcus. I need to see it." He nodded, understanding, and didn't push further that night. He left her office with the fragile beginning of something rebuilding between them, though he knew the real test was still ahead. Aurelia's board reconvened a week later to finalize their decision on the merger, and Preston Hale, sensing his window closing, made one final desperate move. He arranged a press conference outside the building on the morning of the vote, flanked by a small cluster of reporters he'd cultivated relationships with, and delivered a statement questioning both Simone's leadership and Marcus's business ethics, implying without quite stating outright that the merger had been compromised by personal entanglement from the start. Marcus arrived that morning not in a suit, but in the flannel shirt and work boots that had started this entire story, the Civic parked deliberately at the curb where every camera could see it. He walked past Preston's press conference without acknowledging it, Zora's small hand tucked into his, having decided, after long consideration, that his daughter deserved to witness her father choosing honesty publicly rather than hiding from the consequences of his choices. Reporters swarmed toward them, shouting questions, and Marcus stopped on the steps of the building, crouching down briefly to make sure Zora was all right before straightening to face the cameras. "I'll keep this brief," he said. "Everything reported about my personal deception is true. I hid my wealth from women I dated for years, including from Ms. Bellamy, because past experiences left me afraid of being loved for the wrong reasons. That fear led me to build a life of half-truths, and it hurt someone I cared deeply about. I own that fully." He glanced down at Zora, who was watching him with wide, serious eyes. What isn't true is any suggestion that this merger was built on anything but sound business fundamentals. Ms. Bellamy's judgment as an executive has never wavered, even while I was busy failing her as a person. Those are two separate facts, and I won't let anyone blur them to score points. A reporter shouted a question about whether the relationship had ended, and Marcus felt Zora's grip tighten on his hand. "That's between me and her," he said simply. "But I'll say this. I'm done hiding. From reporters, from boardrooms, and from the people I love. However this ends, it ends with the truth." Inside the building, Simone watched the press conference unfold on a live feed in her office, her CFO and general counsel flanking her in tense silence. When Marcus finished speaking, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The board vote that afternoon approved the merger by a comfortable margin, the public honesty from both parties apparently defusing much of the ammunition Preston Hale had hoped to weaponize. Preston's own firm, in the following weeks, would find itself scrutinized by the same reporters he'd courted, several unflattering stories surfacing about his own business practices that effectively ended his attempt to insert himself into Aurelia's affairs. But the resolution that mattered most to Marcus had nothing to do with board votes or press conferences. He found Simone that evening at Delphine's, of all places, sitting in the same corner booth where their entire story had started, still wearing her work clothes though her hair had come loose from its careful style, strands falling around her face in a way that made her look, for the first time since the boardroom reveal, like the woman he'd fallen for in the first place. "You came back here," he said, sliding into the booth across from her. "I still work a shift here sometimes," she said. "Even now. Reggie lets me, no questions asked. It reminds me who I actually am underneath everything else." She looked at him carefully. "That press conference was either the bravest or most reckless thing I've ever seen a man do. Probably both." He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, giving her room to close the distance if she wanted to. "I meant every word. I'm done hiding, Simone. Not just from reporters. From you. I want to show you the real version of my life, penthouse and all, empire and all. And I want you to see it not as something to be impressed by, but as something I'm finally not afraid to let you inside." She was quiet for a long moment, studying him, and then, slowly, she closed the distance and laced her fingers through his. "Zora's been asking about you," he added. "Every day since the news broke. She wants to know if you're still coming to their house." "Our house," Simone corrected softly, testing the phrase, and something in Marcus's chest cracked open with relief and love in equal measure. "Our house," he agreed. She smiled, small and real, the guarded distance she'd maintained since the boardroom finally beginning to thaw. "I'm still angry with you," she said. "I want you to know that. This isn't some instant forgiveness moment. I know, but I also spent the last 2 weeks realizing I've never once, in 8 years of running that company, let anyone see me the way you've seen me. Tired, ordinary, real, even hiding my wealth. I was somehow more myself with you than I've been with anyone in a decade." She squeezed his hand. "That has to mean something." "It means everything," he said quietly. They sat together in the diner as the evening light faded outside the windows. No cameras, no boardrooms, no billion-dollar deals hovering over their heads. Just two people slowly, carefully, rebuilding trust one honest conversation at a time. Reggie brought over 2 slices of cherry pie without being asked, setting them down with a knowing look before retreating back to the kitchen. 3 weeks later, Marcus invited Simone to the penthouse for the first time, and Zora orchestrated the entire evening with the meticulous seriousness of a 6-year-old event planner, insisting on a specific seating arrangement, a specific movie for after dinner, and a specific outfit that she'd picked out herself, a sundress covered in tiny embroidered suns. Simone arrived to find the dinner table set not with staff-prepared catering, but with a slightly lopsided homemade lasagna that Marcus had clearly attempted himself. Flowers still dusted faintly on the kitchen counter behind him. "You cooked," she said, surprised. "Badly," he admitted, "but I wanted the night to be us. Not a caterer's version of impressive." Zora insisted on saying grace before dinner, adding her own addendum at the end that made both adults go quiet. "And thank you for Simone finding out my daddy's secret," she said solemnly, eyes closed, hands folded, because now she doesn't have to leave the way Mommy did, because she already knows everything and she's still here. Marcus felt his throat tighten, and across the table Simone reached over to squeeze Zora's small hand, her own eyes glassy. "I'm not going anywhere, baby," Simone said softly. "I promise you that." After dinner, while Zora fell asleep halfway through the movie curled against Simone's side on the couch, Marcus watched the two of them together, his daughter's dark curls against Simone's shoulder, and understood with sudden clarity that this, precisely this, unremarkable and quiet and entirely unstaged, was the thing he'd been protecting all along without fully realizing it. Not his fortune, not his privacy. This exact possibility, a family built on truth instead of test. Later, after he'd carried Zora to bed and returned to find Simone standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, he came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I used to think proving myself meant hiding everything," he said quietly. "Building walls so tall nothing could get past them to hurt me again. But somewhere between diner pie and food truck festivals, I think you taught me the walls were the problem, not the solution." Simone turned to face him, the city lights glittering behind her. "I used to think power meant never needing anyone," she said. "That if I built something big enough, I'd never have to feel small again. But you saw me small, Marcus. Tired, uncertain, hiding in an apron behind a name tag that wasn't even straight. And you never once made me feel like less because of it." "You were never less," he murmured. "Not for 1 second. I love you," she said, the words arriving simply, without fanfare, exactly the way real declarations tend to arrive when all the performance has finally been stripped away. Not the billionaire, not the man in the flannel shirt either. Just you, underneath both of those versions, the one who left a good tip before he could afford it and told his daughter words matter. "I love you too," Marcus said, cupping her face in his hands. "I have for a long time now. I just needed to stop being afraid long enough to say it." He kissed her then, slow and certain. No hidden identity between them anymore. No test running quietly beneath the surface. Just two people who had found each other twice, once by accident in a diner booth, and once again in the harder, more deliberate work of choosing honesty over armor. Down the hall, Zora slept peacefully, unaware that her small persistent questions over cherry pie had done as much to build this family as any boardroom vote or press conference ever could, unaware that somewhere in her 6-year-old wisdom she had understood, long before the adults around her, that love worth trusting was never about the car you drove or the money in your account, but about who showed up consistently and kindly when nobody was watching, and who stayed once everything hidden had finally been brought into the light.